Hello, everyone. In this edition of my biography series, we will be discussing the life of the first president of the United States, George Washington Carver. Oh, wait, wrong guy. Okay, I'll restart. Hello, everyone. In this edition of my biography series, we will be discussing the life of the first president of the U.S., my great-great-grandmother's husband's brother's grandfather's wife's grandfather's wife's grandfather's brother's wife's brother's grandmother's sister's great-grandfather's mother's husband, George Washington. Without further ado, here is his life, and here is my biography of him. Let's begin, shall we? On February 22nd, 1732, if you use the Julian calendar like Washington's family did, or February 11th, 1731, in the Gregorian calendar, on this day, 289 years ago, George Washington was born in this house called Pope Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was born to Augustine Washington, who had 4 houses and 6 properties, and Mary Ball Washington, who worshipped rocks and prayed for them to bless her children. Weird parents. By 1738, George Washington had moved to his 4th house, known as Ferry Farm. He would remain here for the next decade or so. During this time, the famous myth that George Washington cut down his father's cherry tree was supposedly a thing, but this myth is completely bogus and has no evidence. Suddenly, on April 12, 1743, George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, was like, you know what, I'm going to go and ride my horse. During his horse ride, he got cold and just fell on the ground and died. No sickness or illness, he just got cold and died. This obviously left George and Mary Washington devastated, and so at age 11, George was put in charge of the family farm by his mother. He was also put in charge of the slaves. Yeah, I'll talk about the slave thing later. In 1746, George Washington, who was set to start school at age 14, yes, he didn't know how, wasn't able to since his father died. And so he began reading book after book after book after book after book so he could learn basic skills. He got fairly smart in everything but math. He was hilariously bad at math. Anyways, after his failing in math, he would eventually, want a vacation. And so he went to the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, which is now his own country and has an epic flag. That's also where Rihanna is from. On October 31st, Halloween of 1753, George Washington, at age 21, was conscripted by the British to join their army to tell the French to off. And so, after the French refused to leave the North American continent, the British declared war, beginning the French and Indian War. It lasted from 1754 to 1763. During this time, George Washington reached the rank of Lieutenant Colonel General for the British. So yeah, he fought for the British. During the Battle of Jumonville Glen, Washington said, quote, I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound. 1758, after leaving the British Army and becoming a veteran, George Washington entered politics. He was elected to represent Frederick County, Virginia, in the House of Burgesses, the precursor to the Virginia House of Representatives. Then, George Washington began hitting on a woman named Sally Fairfax, who wanted to run off with him, and she and her husband, George Fairfax, who, hilariously enough, was Washington's closest friend. Washington eventually called off this relationship in favor of marrying another woman named Martha Parke Custis, or Martha Washington. On January 6, 1759, George Washington married Martha Custis, who would later become known as Martha Washington. In 1761, George Washington's sister-in-law died, leaving behind Mount Vernon to George and Martha Washington. They then moved in and established it as their primary residence. This would be their main residence for the rest of their lives. In 1766, Washington made Mount Vernon into a plantation by building a wheat farm and much later a whiskey distillery, which he wouldn't have that long to use. Martha also built a garden, which is still used today. Oh, and I've been to Mount Vernon. I would very much recommend visiting if you can. On June 15, 1775, George Washington, at age 43, became Commander-in-Chief of the American Army during the American Revolution, where the American colonists revolted against the British's taxes because they were broke. He then, along with 55 other old white guys called delegates, on July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, signed the Declaration of Independence, marking the point of no return for the Americans in the American Revolution. On Christmas, or December 25th of 1776, the same year, Washington crossed the Delaware River to surprise attack the British, which very much surprised them, which would lead to a victory. Then, in 1778, he fought at the Battle of Valley Forge during a brutal winter, and he would finally finish off what he started and finish off the British at the Siege of Yorktown. Washington would retire from the U.S. Army on December 23rd, 1783. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States of America in New York City, which was then the capital of the nation, the first, in fact. During the inauguration, Washington was thought to be a little drunk. He wasn't. He was completely sober. The reason why people thought he sounded a little drunk is because he had only one real tooth. The rest of his teeth were dentures, made of either brass, ivory, and even slave teeth. Anyways, Washington would serve 2 terms as president, being re-inaugurated in 1792, this time in Philadelphia. He would be president until 1797. In 1797, Washington retired from the presidency, opting to return back to Mount Vernon and allow John Adams to take the presidency as the second president, making Thomas Jefferson eccentrically happy. On December 14th, 1799, after a long historic life, George Washington fell ill with quinsy, a form of tonsillitis. His doctors brilliantly let him get bit by leeches, gave him elixir, and other great things. This would contribute to his death on the same day. Washington was bound to die. I mean, we might as well call him Disease Washington. He had everything under the sun: tuberculosis, diphtheria, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, carbuncle, epiglottitis, and pneumonia. In the following months, Martha grieved a heck of a lot, and she stopped the U.S. government from having him be buried in the U.S. Capitol, the original plan, fun fact, and had him get buried at Mount Vernon. His original tomb almost caved in. It grew so deteriorated after Martha's death that a French guy built him a new one. So, yeah, I've also been to Washington's grave. So, yeah. And with that was my biography on the life of the man we call George Washington. Thank you all so much for watching my biography of the first American president. As you saw in the intro, I do have a connection to him through marriage, which is cool. Anyways, as for what's coming up next, my next video will be another history video, not on a country, but on an event. The event is the Salem Witch Trials, coming out on February 28th. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you then.